What's up, African American history family? Promised you guys some vids. I made one the other day. I didn't love it. I may still post it, but I actually got up, got dressed, did a little homework. So I thought I'd go all in, maybe try to give you like 10 minutes worth here. So we were talking World War One today. We were talking 1920s Black America, which of course encompasses Harlem, and then we're going to talk a little bit Great Depression. Okay. So on draft day in World War One, 700,000 blacks registered for the draft immediately. There was a real dearth of African Americans in the military prior to that, about 20,000 in the Army, no Marines whatsoever, maybe about 5,000 in the Navy. Of those 700,000 that registered for the draft, 31% had their draft registrations accepted versus 26% of white Americans, which suggests that we were admitted at a higher rate. You can make what you will of that. During the course of the war, we served in mostly sort of menial backup roles. Vast majorities of African Americans worked as stevedores in the docks throughout Europe, loading and unloading all different types of equipment for the war. Some blacks served as Seabees during the war. We build, we fight. And other blacks actually saw action. The Harlem 369th is probably the most famous unit that fought in that war, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. One of the heroes of that group was Freddie Stowers. My man Freddie Stowers, one of my favorite names in history. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1991, I believe. Now that's the first black man in any war to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Now remember, we fought in the 7 Years' War, the Revolutionary War, 1812, keep going and going and going. But it's not till 1991 that Stowers is actually recognized for his efforts. We received better treatment in Europe than we did in the United States. So some black folks like Josephine Baker, she actually is going to stay in France during this time. Noble Cece, a band leader, and other black musicians that travel with the army in Europe receive a much better acceptance in Europe at the time than blacks were back in the United States. And German forces even littered black lines during the war with propaganda asking blacks, why would you fight for a country that back home, you know, your brothers and sisters are being lynched? And mind you, when we got back home, numbers of black folks were actually lynched within uniform at the time. Domestic United States was just tumultuous during that time. There's a group of black soldiers who were sent to Texas in the Houston area to help build Fort Logan. They're going to get into disputes with the town people who hate them. Allegedly, there was an assault of a black woman that a soldier witnessed. He intervened, and later that night, what ensued was a riot in which 16 town folks died, including 5 police officers. The army was livid. The federal government was livid. They sent in a guy named Emmett Scott, who was the protege of Booker T. Washington, to investigate the whole incident. In the end, like 113 black troops are indicted. Get this right, 13 soldiers were hanged, the largest mass hanging in U.S. military history for that incident. And the tensions during the course of World War I amongst black soldiers back home was very real. You know, it was a very, very difficult time. I mentioned the Harlem Hellfighters. They actually fought in the front lines and served in the trenches 191 straight days. That was pretty remarkable. And black folks purchased about $250 million in war bonds during World War I. You might know a little bit about the CPA. I know John Baker does. I'm sorry, the CPI. The CPI. I don't have a CPA. I don't need one. But selling war bonds was an art form that black folks got caught up in too. So we contributed financially towards that war as well. Some of you might know about the Alien, or not the Alien and Sedition Act. That's 1798. That's John Adams. What is it? Part of it's the Sedition Act. Another part of it has a different portion. But there were folks that were locked up under that, like Eugene Debs, the famous socialist during that time. And in black America, A. Philip Randolph was actually locked up for speaking out against the government at the time. And Chandler Owen was another black man who was arrested up under the Sedition Act for speaking out against the U.S. government during World War I. If we transition into the Great Migration, I'll get this out, I'll spit this out. We're talking about this movement, this mass movement of black people out of the South into portions of the Midwest and the Northeast. You know, by World War I, almost 90% of black folks are still in the Deep South. The war will draw people out of the South into industries in the Northeast, in the Midwest. So cities like Akron, Trenton, Buffalo, Harrisburg, smaller cities will see an increase in black population. And then a place like Chicago sees its black population go up 60% from 1910 to 1920. You also see a similar growth within Harlem and New York City at that time. Black folks, we came north, we brought music, we brought ideas, we brought food, we brought culture. And it's not just a onerous sort of universal black culture that is transitioning and migrating into the north. It's all these micro southern cultures. So, blacks from North Carolina or Kentucky or Georgia, like my people, have these really unique sort of cultural genomes that are spreading off into all these different corridors in the Midwest and the Northeast during that time. Of course, they'll lead to things like jazz and rock and roll, some very famous American contributions, and it also leads to Harlem. So Harlem becomes the epicenter of black culture in the 1920s. The new Negro movement, as coined by Alan Locke, describes black intellectuals who are going to gravitate towards Harlem. It's not just black intellectuals, hundreds of thousands of black people will wind up there. Between 1900 and 1930, 150,000 black Caribbeans migrated into the United States, predominantly into Harlem in that region. That's when Colin Powell's people came during that time. And what you found in Harlem was just this explosion of ideas and energy and culture. It manifested itself in great authors like Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, as I mentioned, Alan Locke, Langston Hughes, W.B. Du Bois is there. It's a real explosion of understanding and expression that had not been seen before in white America. And to be truthful, guys like Carl Van Vechten, he writes a book called Negro Heaven that is really disrupting and controversial within black circles. So there's also quite a bit of interpersonal inspection amongst black communities taking place in Harlem during this time period. You had black theater for the first time, black directors, black leads on Broadway. You had black song performers that will really be the forebearers of sort of the diva movement you see later on. I mentioned Josephine Baker, who becomes very popular in the States and leaves for France, but there are many others who stay within the United States. Jazz and guys like Jelly Roll Morton are hitting in Harlem at the time. The Lincoln Motion Picture Company, which I think I mentioned in my writings earlier today, a guy by the name of Oscar Michaud and some other investors are going to create a motion picture company that's run by black folks in Harlem at the time. Harlem is very accepting and robust. The LGBTQ community is out in many ways in Harlem at the time. The Hamilton Lodge, which you heard me mention in class previously, becomes this real destiny for all kinds of people, but drag shows are featured there, and thousands of people will attend these shows during the course of that decade. I mean, Harlem is important in the sense that it expresses something that's been internalized, I think, within black America for a very long time. Once the Great Depression comes at the end of the 1920s, a lot of those brothers and sisters transition to Chicago, and they have what's called the Chicago Renaissance. We see very similar demonstrations of black cultural expression taking place during that time. If I were to sort of finish up with some of this other stuff I talked about today, I transitioned into the Great Depression. Now, mind you, the 1920s was a commercialism decade. It's brought to us by the presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, all of whom are financial conservatives. They are going to deregulate everything imaginable within the U.S. government. The economy on paper is going to grow at a radical rate. Well, even a guy like Harding is really credited for, he has an administration called the Ohio Gang that are a bunch of bums and crooks. But he did have a few good people that he put in place that helped to grow and build early 1920s economy. And it's all about spending. Even though you're in the midst of Prohibition, that's why Harlem's weird and unique too. Harlem is like Prohibition. I mean, Harlem's like a place, San Francisco's a place that Prohibition just doesn't hit the same. It's just different there. People are not just out in a way I was speaking of, but out in a more broadly societal celebratory way in the 1920s in Harlem. But the 20s is about spending, it's about acquiring, it's also about mass production. So you have a lot of black folks who moved into the Northeast, into the Midwest, and got into industries where they were able to make some capital, a little bit of leisure money, if you will, but never able to obtain on the level that white Americans could. It's also the beginning of real federally financed segregated housing in the United States. Eventually you'll see someone like the current president's father get into this racket where the feds will give you big loans in order to build these housing developments and buy real estate, etc. But they all have these clauses within them, these no sale clauses that require that buyers and purchasers can't sell to certain groups. One of those groups being African Americans, frankly. So the 20s might have been roaring in some ways for some people, but it's really the same struggle. I mean, Harlem was an aberration, right? Harlem was an outlier. In 29, the Great Depression hits, and it's a global depression. It goes across the earth. I posted an article today on cot sales in Somalia. It's a stimulant you chew in Somalia. And they closed their border with Kenya because of the coronavirus, but that cot sale within Mogadishu and those markets is so important for people there. And so it reminded me of the Great Depression and how quickly a globally impactful event, in this case the virus that I'm talking about, can have an immediate impact on the smallest of communities across the globe, as the example I just gave you. So yeah, during the Great Depression, the whole world's going to feel the impact of what took place in the markets in the United States. Langston Hughes said, Great Depression took everybody down a few rungs on the ladder. The problem was black people were already on the bottom rung. Because of that, we will suffer disproportionately during the Great Depression. The National Recovery Act, the NRA, was nicknamed Negro Robbed Again by a lot of black people. It just didn't serve us equally. FDR was no fan of civil rights. His wife, Eleanor, was much more of a proponent. In 1939, she forced and pressured the powers that be to allow Marian Anderson to sing at Constitution Hall, a group that my kids are laughing. I don't know if it's at me. A group that Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of, Daughters of the American Revolution, had banned Anderson from performing there, but she pushed hard and advocated for it. Later on, Roosevelt will go and visit the Tuskegee Airmen. It is because of Eleanor's trip there that the Red Tails actually get into the war later on. So she's much more a proponent of black civil rights than her husband. FDR realizes that if he loses the federal Democrats, he'll lose the votes he needs to keep getting his New Deal legislations passed. So, be that as it may, he hired a black cabinet, quote unquote. I could make a woodworking joke, no need. It was led by Mary McLeod Bethune. She was the Director of Minority Affairs, kind of an unofficial title. It included Harold Ickes, former director of the NAACP. It had Carter G. Woodson, kind of America's first black historian, as considered by many. E. Franklin Frazier, many consider to be America's first black American sociologist. And what that group did was inform or consult FDR, shouldn't have touched my nose, on issues of black America. Most programming in the New Deal did not reach black folks. There was a saying in the South, no blacks work until all whites work. And because of that, jobs like sleeping car porter, janitor, etc., used to be dominated by blacks, will now be infiltrated and taken over by whites. Guys like W.B. Du Bois will say, don't buy where you can't work. So there'll be a counter-black campaign in the South that says, well, we're not going to shop where we can't work. There's a lot of tension down there. Even the CCC crews, the Civilian Conservation Corps crews, are realistic about this. 200,000 blacks worked for the CCC during the Great Depression, and almost all of those folks were sent up north to work in northern enclaves because of the fear of the violence they might face if they were put to work in the South during that time. Trying to think. I talked to you about, and I typed about some unemployment numbers. It's insane. I mean, you have numbers as 60% Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, about 50% in Harlem, and a massive 80% in Norfolk. You do have these oddities though, like Atlanta Life is an insurance company started by this black dude during this time frame. He makes like $1 million in the 1930s. Life insurance. Let me tell you something, folks. Insurance always sells. One of them rackets. Uh, throughout the course of the 30s, there's this transition, though. This is when you see black folks really gravitate towards the Democratic Party. I credit Eleanor Roosevelt in her work for that as much as anything. FDR is just not that big a proponent of equality in many ways. When Truman comes to power eventually, he'll do more sort of federally around civil rights legislation than FDR did. So the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, really hurt sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Not that that was a good life anyway, but that didn't do us any damn good either. We benefited a little bit from the WPA, the Works Project Administration, but most of that catered towards white professionals. When we could get in and out, we did. But, like Hughes said, Great Depression took everybody down if food runs on the ladder. The problem was black folks was already on the bottom ladder. So, as we exit through the 1930s, there's war around the world. In 1935, the Italians invaded Ethiopia. They're seeking revenge for an 1898 ass whooping they took at a place called Adu. And in 1936, Francisco Franco will take over the elected government within Spain. The Japanese, beginning in 1930, will rage through Manchuria and into China. And you really have a world that's approaching a world war as I conclude this video for today. So when I hit you next time, which will be probably this week, maybe a little bit shorter video, I'm going to talk about World War II, specifically, black folks' entrance into that war. I want to look at civil rights gains and pioneering during that time. We'll talk about Jackie Robinson and his role in 1947 of really changing the way we think about civil rights in the United States. And then we'll segue towards the 1950s, sort of the Leave It to Beaver era in the major American mind. But again, a disproportionately disappointing decade for black folks because we just aren't going to be able to access certain programmings that come out of World War II that other communities will be able to. Well, I miss you guys. I miss getting up. I miss getting dressed. It's hard for everybody, so just keep pushing forward. I appreciated all the feedback that I got in the discussion tab last time. Feel free to comment on the videos, and I will hit you guys with another one again soon. All right? Be easy.